Okay, good afternoon, all. I hope you are doing well. We're going to talk about post-impressionism today, so I hope you have your syllabi handy. There are four artists associated with the post-impressionist movement. Van Gogh, whose name really should be pronounced Van Gogh, and Toulouse-Lautrec, Paul Cézanne, and Paul Gauguin. From among those four, please do put checks in front of Van Gogh's name and also Toulouse-Lautrec's. Before we begin, I want to remind you of a few things. Attendance. It's required that attendance is taken for all students, so there will be instructions in this session for you to do so. It involves sending me an email. The other thing that I want to bring up before we begin is the final exam. It's going to be modified, and there will be no slide identification. It will consist of all essay questions. It will be open book, open note, so you can use anything that you want. I'm looking for approximately 1 page per answer, again, as was the case on the midterm. And you may use anything, of course, that I have said, just paraphrase it. If, however, you use something from a book or an article, do please, in order to avoid plagiarism, enclose it in quotation marks and cite the source, please. So let's begin. And I want to show you this particular self-portrait by Vincent van Gogh. We'll start with his work, which is in the collection of the DIA. So when it's possible to go back there, please do and enjoy this piece. By the way, Van Gogh at one point said that he wanted to do portraits, and I think you obviously can include self-portraits among them as well, which would be in 100 years, as he put it, capable of radiating. And when it is possible to go to the DIA, sit in front of this piece, stand in front of it. I don't remember if there's a bench there, and enjoy it. And it really does indeed radiate, if you will. Pardon me. I hope you've enjoyed some of the films that I've sent you on the post-impressionist. If you haven't viewed them yet, please do. But Van Gogh lived from 1853 to 1890, so he had a tragically short life. And he really, along with Toulouse-Lautrec, is the epitome of the tragic artist figure. It's true. I know that many of you, if not all of you, know quite a bit about his life, but I do want to give you an overview of his life. He was born in Holland, near Belgium, to a family of ministers and art dealers, as I said, in 1853. And his family was involved with art and religion. He vacillated pretty much between the two his entire life. And I think gradually he was able to some degree, fuse his interest in religion and his interest in art. But Van Gogh, from a very early age, had a sense of guilt. And there had been another son that was born about a year before Vincent was, and the family named that son Vincent as well. He died in infancy. And Van Gogh's father, pardon me, was a minister. So the body of this child was buried in a cemetery that adjoined his church. And so what I'm saying to you is that virtually every day of young Vincent's life, he walked by a cemetery, and there was a headstone that read Vincent van Gogh. And I know that you are aware that Van Gogh had many, many mental issues, emotional, psychological issues. And there are all kinds of theories as to what caused them. And they range from anything from a particular form of epilepsy of the temporal lobe to magnesium deficiency. It ran the gamut. And excuse me, in 1877, he actually entered the ministry, wanting to follow in his footsteps, the footsteps of his fathers. He, however, was dismissed from the seminary because the people that were in charge believed that he did not have good oratory skills, so he couldn't be a good preacher. However, he wanted to continue to follow his dream, and he did. Becoming an itinerant minister in what we might call today a non-denominational church. And he worked among very, very poor people, abjectly poor people in a mining district in Belgium. He took Jesus's teachings quite literally. And in addition to ministering to the spiritual needs of his congregation. He thought it was necessary to help them in their physical needs as well. So he started giving away his own personal property. And when it got to the point that he had actually given away his shoes and he was literally walking around barefoot, the powers that were in his ministry dismissed him as being, in quotes, overly zealous. So this brought about a certain religious crisis. He, from that point on, never set foot in another church again. He completely abandoned established religion. But it's important for you to keep in mind that throughout his entire life, there was a very strong religious bent in his personality. And images such as Starry Night, with which you are, of course, familiar, and you'll see a little bit later on during our presentation, I think exemplifies this. And eventually, Van Gogh took the star as being a symbol of the spiritual realm. Nonetheless, he abandoned religion and he decided to follow art. So he went to The Hague, a city in Holland, and he had a cousin there who was an artist. Her name was Mauve. She gave him some training. And while he was there, he picked up a prostitute who was pregnant in the street. He took her home. He tried to help her. She had children as well. And eventually, tragically, what happened is she essentially stole what little he had and left. And he regarded this in a fairly philosophical sense, writing to his brother Theo. And you probably know that he was very close to his brother. That, in quotes, while trying to go deeper into art, I tried to go deeper into life, for the two go hand in hand. By the way, if you want to learn more about Van Gogh the man and Van Gogh the artist, do pick up the correspondence that he had with his brother Theo, which is in translation, and it will be well worth your while. He did have some formal training in art. He went to the Antwerp School of Fine Arts. And then in 1886, he moved to Paris. Everything was happening in Paris in those days. And he made contact with the people who were the Impressionists, and eventually those people who became the Post-Impressionists, that is Gauguin and Cézanne, and another artist named Seurat, who became associated with a style called Neo-Impressionism. So for 2 years he lived there. Things were pretty good, and then his health started to decline. He was drinking too much. So he decided that he had to leave Paris, which he did, and he went to the south of France to a town called Arles. Arles is the way that is spelled, just for your information. And it was an important experience for him because of the quality of light. When he had moved to Paris a few years earlier and discovered the work of the Impressionist, his palette, of course, lightened considerably from what it had been earlier. You'll see the evolution of his art in just a couple of minutes, but it became even more intense in terms of the color when he was in Arles because of the quality of the sun. Van Gogh eventually developed a dream, excuse me, of establishing an artist commune. And in his dream, artists would help each other, not only financially, but in terms of their own art. It would be an emotionally supportive group. And he picked on exactly the wrong person to ask to be, if you will, a co-founder of this community. And that was Paul Gauguin. Now, Gauguin was a great artist, it's true, but he was not a nice human being. Van Gogh badgered him, continuing to correspond with him, asking him to come down to Arles. And after a while, Gauguin finally did relent, and he did join Van Gogh in the south of France. This is very recent scholarship, but we have learned recently that, in fact, apparently the reason that Gauguin did relent and join Van Gogh in the south of France is because Theo was worried about Vincent, and Theo paid Gauguin in order to do so. So they painted together en plein air, which is the French expression, I hope you remember, for painting outdoors. It was developed by the Impressionists. They supported each other. Things were good for a while. And then they started turning bad. And from everything that I understand in terms of their relationship, painting together, Gauguin would very often take credit for innovations that, in fact, Van Gogh did develop himself. And again, from what I've read about Van Gogh's personality, it seems that he was incapable of turning his anger against somebody else. Rather, he turned it inward. You probably have heard the expression that depression is anger turned inward. And I think in many cases, that's what was going on here. So the relationship began to go south. And actually, what happened, you probably heard this situation. They had a terrible fight one night when Gauguin announced that he was going to leave and go back to Paris. And Van Gogh grabbed a straight razor. He pursued Gauguin, who decided, obviously, that discretion was the better part of valor. And he went into the town. Van Gogh could not find him. He went back home. He turned the razor against himself and he cut off part of his ear. Then he went into the village and he gave it to a prostitute named Rachel. Gauguin left very shortly after that. And again, for Vincent, things began to go very seriously downhill. There was a voluntary internment in an asylum near Arles in May of 1889. And then several months later, he went into another asylum at Saint-Rémy, which was, by the way, a very, very productive period for him. He had quite compassionate doctors who gave him whatever he needed in terms of art supplies. So he produced quite a bit of work. He went back to Paris, or near Paris, I should say. And in 1890, he shot himself in a field. Now, I need to tell you, and probably many of you are aware of this, that there is some controversy now as to whether or not indeed he shot himself or whether or not he was accidentally shot by some young people. We don't know. We will never know. Take a look, if you can, at the film Loving Vincent. It's a wonderful film, and the premise in that particular film is, in fact, that it was an accidental shooting. But nonetheless, he did manage to stagger back to the place where he was staying, and Theo did see him before he died. It was believed that he would live. Yes, he was very badly injured, but apparently at one point he was actually sitting up in bed and smoking a pipe, but his condition took a turn for the worse during that particular night, and he did die. So let's take a look at some of the other images. This is called The Potato Eaters, and it is, again, done by Vincent van Gogh. It's a much earlier work. And if it looks to you similar in terms of form, at least in terms of coloration and value, to that of the Dutch Baroque, it certainly should, because Van Gogh is referring to his own legacy of the Dutch Baroque, and specifically Rembrandt in this particular piece. But what you have here, clearly, are abjectly poor people. And I think in many ways, they are very much similar to the sort of people that constituted his congregation when he worked among the very poor coal miners in Belgium. So you see people who are old before their time. You see people who clearly have to work very hard for a living. Their facial features are gnarled. Their hands are gnarled, if you take a look at the knuckles. And they're living, obviously, in a horribly dank environment. And if you take a look at what they have for their supper, it is, in fact, as the title implies, a platter of potatoes and some beverage, be it coffee or tea. Now, you have to understand that at the time period we're talking about, the eyes of potatoes were thought to be, of course, erroneously, but were thought to be poisonous. So what I'm saying to you is these people are in such a desperate condition that they're eating a substance that they have reason to believe is toxic. This is a pretty important work, even though it's fairly early, so you might put a check in front of it. Again, it is entitled The Potato Eaters. And this is called Bedroom at Arles. Sometimes it's called Vincent's Bedroom. And again, it's a pretty important work of art. By this point in time, he was in Paris. And you can see, in fact, some of the influences of the Impressionist movement very clearly in this particular piece. And before we go any farther, I want to tell you some of the similarities and differences between Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. The similarities have to do primarily in terms of form. So you see an asymmetrical compositional configuration here. Pardon me, you have bright coloration, you have a bird's eye view approach to space. These are all tendencies that were derived from the formal elements of Impressionism. The differences between Impressionism and Post-Impressionism are twofold. Number one, as opposed to the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists do not dissolve form in white light. line form is pretty important to them. And you can see that Van Gogh in this particular piece has taken a pretty judicial approach to the usage of line. The second major difference between these two styles has to do with theme. As I pointed out to you when we talked about the Impressionist painters, the Impressionists were not in the least bit interested in so-called traditional theme, that is something to do with the nature of the human condition, but rather if you happen to be somebody like Monet, you would paint a haystack, you would paint a figure. It was just quite simply a form to reflect light and to be dissolved in white light. By contrast, to one degree or another, the post-impressionist painters do reintroduce traditional theme, by which I mean something that has to do with the nature of the human condition. So let's talk about this piece in terms of theme and formal elements. Theme, first of all. Interestingly enough, he did this particular piece when he was trying to convince Gauguin to come to Arles. He was in Arles by this point in time. And there is some suggestion that actually he did it for his brother Theo, to point out to Theo that everything was okay with him, that he was living in a pretty comfortable domestic environment. Again, there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that that is the case. But clearly there is suggested in this piece, in a psychological sense, some need for a sense of companionship. So if you take a look throughout this piece, excuse me, the elements are repeated in number twos. So if you take a look, there are two pillows on the bed, there are two portraits on the wall. At the right, I know the one on the left looks very much like Van Gogh. In fact, it was not a self-portrait, it was a portrait of a Belgian poet. Take a look at the fact that there are two chairs. Take a look at the windows. Admittedly, that's the design of French windows at this point in time, but he's emphasized the two-part quality of them. So once more, the suggestion thematically in this particular painting is that Van Gogh was experiencing some need for companionship, some need for friendship. And again, as I pointed out to you, at the point in time that he did this, he was trying to convince Gauguin to come down to Arles. Take a look at formal elements, if you would, please, as well. So you have, once more, as I said, the asymmetrical compositional configuration, bird's eye view, fairly loose application of paint throughout, that is a painterly approach, but by the same token, there is the judicial use of line throughout, and bird's eye view approach to space. I guess I said that, didn't I? So do check this painting. It's fairly important. The sunflowers, and I'm sure you know that these are pretty important pieces. A number of years ago, this particular piece sold for something like $40 million, which at that point in time was an outrageous price at auction. Now, I'm sure you know that these days works of art go for in the hundreds of millions of dollars, as perhaps obscene as that is. But the story behind this is that, again, by this point in time, Gauguin had said, okay, I'm coming to Arles. So Vincent wanted to prepare the so-called yellow house for him, which was the house where they lived together, and make it a beautiful environment. And he first thought that he would go out into the fields and pick actual sunflowers because they were in bloom at that point in time. And then he decided instead he would actually paint images of sunflowers. So he did a number of them, and he decorated the house with them. If you take a look, you can see the way that he typically signed his name, which was only by his first name because he said that people could not pronounce his name, which should be, as I said, pronounced Van Gogh. But most Americans, most English-speaking people pronounce it Van Gogh. But let me show you a few more by Van Gogh. This is a pretty important piece as well, so please do put a check in front of this work. It is entitled Night Cafe at Arles. And it's generally believed that this is probably the place where Van Gogh and Gauguin would spend a lot of time together. It's some people believe that it is the place that Vincent went the night that he cut off his ear, that he was in pursuit of Gauguin in order to find them. It was done in 1888, and we know that it was also an inn, and we know that Van Gogh had slept there for something like 4 months before he got the yellow house waiting for Gauguin. But Van Gogh made a statement about this particular piece, and he stated he was interested in quotes, conveying the terrible human passions to show that, in quotes, this is a place where a man can lose his mind and commit crimes, an atmosphere of a glowing inferno, pale suffering, the dark powers that rule over a man in his sleep, end quote. So take a look, if you would, at the way that he has rendered the figures in this particular piece. That rather enigmatic figure in white standing behind the pool table. We know that he is the proprietor of this establishment. There's one figure seated all by himself at the extreme left. There's a couple in the background, 2 men at the far right, but they don't seem to be communicating at all. So overall, there is a sense of alienation in this particular piece, with the exception of that couple in the background who seem to be the only people communicating. And I'll tell you right now, folks, from this point in time, that is the late 1880s, moving into the 1890s, and moving into the 20th century as well. The theme of alienation is an ubiquitous one, that is an ever-occurring one in the visual arts as well as the literary arts. So you see it here. Again, it continues into the 20th century with people like Picasso, for that matter, as well, as you will see next week when we talk about what we can with the 20th century. But again, this is a place where men can lose their mind, according to Vincent van Gogh. So take a look at some of the other objects as well. Take a look at the way that he has dealt with the lights. Don't they look like piercing and really rather terrifying eyes? And look at the mirror on the right. Reflected in the mirror are common objects. We don't know what they are. They are highly distorted, and they do take on a form of the threatening, do they not? Now, I don't mean to confuse you. Van Gogh is a post-impressionist artist. That, for all intents and purposes, if you really get down to it, is a fairly useless term. Next week, one of the 20th century styles that we're going to talk about is expressionism. And you will see that the expressionists, distort reality in order to convey some very, very intense emotions. And I think, strictly speaking, it's appropriate and fair to say that in some ways Van Gogh is a proto-expressionist. But again, the term post-impressionist, fairly useless as it is usually applied to his work. Take a look at the pool table. There's some scholarship to suggest that it almost looks like a coffin. Now, I'm the first to admit that there is a whole lot of overly zealous scholarship about Vincent van Gogh's work, and I think that the description of this pool table looking very much like a coffin is an example of that. A couple of years ago when I taught this class, there was a French student in it. And I've been in France. I never really noticed this before, but this particular French student pointed out to us that, in fact, in France, pool tables are much more narrow than they are in this particular country. So what I'm saying to you is probably what Van Gogh is doing here is painting the pool table as it really looked. Take a look at the chromatic intensity of the coloration as well. It's almost painful. You know, the juxtaposition of red against green, those complementary colors, the very, very intense yellow throughout. Again, according to Van Gogh, this is a place where men can lose their minds. This is also Night Cafe at Arles. Take a look at the stars, if you would. Pretty good example of the very, very powerful imagery that he conveyed in the way that he rendered stars. And again, as I said to you a while back, in many respects, stars were used by Van Gogh as being religious symbols. So while as he did, in fact, abandon established religion, he never abandoned a strong sense of spirituality, which often comes across in his art, I think. This is entitled Gauguin's Chair. And it has a companion piece, and I'm sure that you can perhaps guess that the title of that particular piece is Van Gogh's Chair. Unfortunately, I do not have an image of it. I can only describe it to you. But what you see here is an image that is in Gauguin's chair of suggesting some sense of life. There are books on the chair. There's a light lit candle. There's a sconce on the wall. Conversely, Van Gogh's chair is essentially empty. There is no light whatsoever. I think that's very telling. You know, as I said, by this point in time, the relationship was starting to sour and to eventually lead to the incident with the ear and Gauguin's departure from Arles to go back to Paris. This is, of course, his very, very famous painting, Starry Night. It was done during the so-called Saint-Remy period. He was in a mental institution at this point in time. It was done in June 1889 to orient you in terms of time. And this is the typical Saint-Remy style, that is these swirling brushstrokes. And if you've ever seen a Van Gogh painting in the flesh, you will know that it is very, very textural. In some ways, it almost looks like a relief. It's almost as if he attacks the canvas with the brush and the paint. But as I said earlier to you, his doctors were very compassionate, and they gave him 2 rooms in this hospital, one room for his personal living space, and the other room that he could use as essentially a studio. And again, they gave him whatever he needed in terms of art supplies as well. This is a very visionary canvas in many respects, and he said of this particular piece that he painted it in quotes to comply with this terrible need for religion, quote unquote. So a lot of scholars have looked at the fact that the heavenly realm, that is obviously the sky and the stars, seems to be unified with the earthly realm below. And he does that obviously with 2 vertical forms, that is the church spire just to the right of center in this compositional configuration, and the cypress trees on the left. And by the way, he did a number of paintings of cypress trees themselves. On them, he said, "The cypresses preoccupy me. They are beautiful in their lines and proportions, like an Egyptian obelisk. And the green is of so distinguished a quality. It must be seen here against the blue, in the blue, to put it better." Let me show you a few more by Van Gogh. As the years go on, they become more and more, I think, depressing is a safe way to put it. If you take a look at this image, which is an image of a church, and look through the windows and you see nothing. It's blank, it's empty, it's dark. Take a look at the sky, if you would, as well. It's certainly very threatening. And I think it's safe to say that perhaps in the hands of a lesser artist, it would have been a cliche, but certainly not so Van Gogh. Look at the distortion of the perspective here as well. And there was, I should say, a 20th century Italian artist whose name was De Chirico, and he worked in a school called Metaphysical Painting. We will not have time to talk about his work this semester, but at one point he made the following statement. He said, "Who can deny the troubling connection between perspective and metaphysics, quote unquote?" And what he meant by that is that if you set up a sense of distortion of perspective, you set up a sense of anxiety in the viewer. And I think that certainly that's the case here. Take a look at those 2 paths diverging from each other, which seem to go nowhere. It's as if you seem to have been just sort of dumped somewhere. If you've had a chance to view the film, The Impressionists with Tim Marlowe, you will see that Tim Marlowe explores this approach as well. They become very, very difficult, at least I think, to look at. You know, the sense of compression here, the sense of distortion. Very often Van Gogh at this point in time will deal with horizon lines in such a way that it looks almost as if the buildings are about to slide off the edge of the picture plane. These are very, very disturbing films in many ways. You know, of course, that he was a master at dealing with self-portraits, and he painted over 50 self-portraits during his career. He was obsessed with the problem of identity and made some statements such as, "There is something within me. What is it then?" And as I said earlier, he said, I should like to paint portraits which to people living a century from now would be capable of radiating, would look like apparitions. So let me show you a couple of more. This particular self-portrait was done during the San Remi period. So you see the typical swirling, undulating, curvilinear forms that he produced in his work of that point in time. And finally, in this piece, which is, I think, quite wrenching, it's the last major piece that he did, variously entitled Crows Over Wheatfield or Crows Descending Over Wheatfield. And it's likely that this was the field, or at least something very similar to it, where he either shot himself or was shot, ending, obviously, his life a few days later. He did manage, as I said, to live for several days. And as I pointed out to you, some people, including his brother Theo, believed that he, in fact, would live. But it's clearly a very, very ominous work of art. You know, the turbulent sky seemingly descending in an ominous sense on the wheat field. And as I said earlier, we obviously don't know if the crows are taking off or if they're descending, but it does look as if they are descending in a very, very ominous way. Again, the two paths that seem to lead nowhere, to literally dump you in the middle of the road. There have been a number of psychologists who have made statements about this particular piece. And some of their statements I find rather annoying. There is one psychologist who looked at this painting and said that it is obvious that Van Gogh's personality had degenerated by this point in time because the composition of the painting is so disorganized. Now, I do not argue with the first part of that statement. Clearly, his personality had, in many ways, degenerated. After all, he likely committed suicide. He certainly was a very troubled human being for various reasons. We will never know exactly why, but I enumerated some of them to you. But I strenuously object to the second part of that particular psychologist's statement. This is a beautifully organized compositional configuration. I think you will agree. Okay, let's go on to the second post-impressionist, whose name I am going to ask that you keep in mind. This is Toulouse-Lautrec, whose full name, by the way, was Count. He was a true nobleman, Count Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec Montfa. And he is the second of the post-impressionists that I'm going to ask that you keep in mind, and do put a check in front of his name as well. He lived from 1864 to 1901, so he had a tragically short life as well. And he, as Van Gogh, epitomizes very much the image of the alienated and tragic artist figure. So probably you do not know as much about Toulouse-Lautrec's life as you do Vincent van Gogh, but I want to tell you a little bit about it. First of all, in many ways, I think you could consider him a thoroughly modern human being. I'll backtrack in a bit and tell you a little bit about the earlier part of his life, but eventually he gravitated toward Paris, living in the rather decadent world of Montmartre, that is the left bank of Paris. And perhaps he went there partly by choice, that is sociological curiosity, investigating the life of the fin de siècle, and that term, French expression, fin de siècle, quite simply means the end of the century. But it has come to refer specifically to the end of the 19th century, which in many ways was a very decadent point in time. Partly he gravitated there, I think, in the sense of an involuntary involvement as well. He had a physical affliction, and I think in many ways he perhaps felt a sense of camaraderie with many of the alienated people that lived in that area of Paris. But let me tell you a little bit more about his life. As I said, he lived from 1864 to 1901, and he was born to a very old, very aristocratic family. His father was named Count Alphonse de Toulouse-Lautrec Montfa, and his father was a great country gentleman, riding to hounds. He was very much interested in falconry. And at one point, early in Toulouse-Lautrec's life, his father gave him a book on falconry, and he wrote him, "Remember, my son, every creature deprived of liberty soon degenerates and dies." And eventually that's to be prophetic in ways by which Toulouse-Lautrec's rather tragic life did evolve. But at age 14, there was the first of several accidents. Now, there are various stories as to how this happened. One story has it that he fell off a chair. Another story has it that he slipped on a highly polished floor. A third story has it that he fell down a flight of stairs. But nonetheless, he broke his leg. And during recovery, he was going for a walk, and he broke his other leg. And his legs never healed correctly. Probably that was caused by a congenital disorder. His parents were first cousins, and royalty had to marry royalty in these days. And the result of that, of course, was not good in terms of the genetic makeup. But the whole result of this is that his torso developed normally. His legs did not. He never reached 5 feet tall. I think he was something like 4'3" or 4'4" near the end of his life. So if you take a look in the background of this particular piece, which is called the Moulin Rouge, you will see two standing figures, one very tall figure, one very short figure. The short one is, in fact, Toulouse-Lautrec. But during his convalescence, he took drawing lessons, and at age 18, he went to Paris, and he took lessons at the studio of an artist named Cormont. He eventually discovered the work of the Impressionists, Degas, Bert Morisot, Manet, also Japanese art as well. And he tragically became very much of an alcoholic. He would spend hours and hours in these various cabernets, particularly the Moulin Rouge, which in French, by the way, means the Red Mill. It was a club that was built in an old mill on what at that point in time was essentially the outskirts of Paris. And it became a very popular gathering place for the artists and the intellectuals. If you have had a chance to view some of these films that I sent to you, you know that that is the case. So he would spend hours and hours doing drawings on cocktail napkins of the various dancers of the Moulin Rouge. Probably he was so obsessed with dance because he literally had great difficulty walking. He had to use a cane or sometimes two canes, which he referred to as his boot hook. And I should tell you that Toulouse-Lautrec had an exceedingly sardonic, sarcastic sense of humor, and he could slice up anybody that he wanted to with his very witty and caustic tongue, and he regularly did that to members of the aristocracy. However, when it came to members of the lower classes, that is the dancers of the Moulin Rouge or the prostitutes, more often than not, he would treat them with utmost courtesy. At one point, he did a series of portraits of prostitutes in a brothel, and he treated them as if they had been ladies in waiting in the court of perhaps Marie Antoinette. He would often preside over Sunday brunch with them, bringing along a silver tea service as well. But let me get back to the boot hook. If you ride English style, the boots that you wear are very tight-fitting. And the only way you can put them on is by putting hooks inside two tabs in the boots and pulling them on that way. So in referring to his cane as his boot hook, he was satirizing himself. Had things gone, if you will, as they should have, he would have lived the life of a country gentleman the way his father did, that is riding to hounds and engaging in falconry. But he eventually did become disabled, as you know. So eventually, the alcoholism became very, very bad. And his father, in fact, ordered him to be interned in a hospital. And Toulouse-Lautrec wrote him, and he quoted the letter that his father had sent him as a young man. That is, "Remember, my son, every creature deprived of liberty soon degenerates and dies." And he used that as a context to ask his father to release him from this prison. And tragically, his father did. Tragically, I say, because things went from bad to worse. He wandered the streets of Paris. He was delusional. He was hallucinating, drinking far too much. He would throw parties, and more often than not, he would pass out way before the party was over. And one of the dancers of the Moulin Rouge, Jane Averill, who was a very close personal friend of Toulouse-Lautrec, excuse me, would often preside over these parties. And by the way, she and his mother were the only two people that he really allowed to get close to him during the course of his life. But let's take a look at this particular piece fairly carefully at this point. And as I said, that's Toulouse-Lautrec in the background, walking next to his cousin Tapier de Célimon, who was very, very tall and very thin. And Toulouse-Lautrec, sardonic as he was, liked that contrast between the two of them in terms of their stature. The woman to the right of them, raising her hands, is La Goulou. That's a nickname which translates as the glutton or the greedy one. She too was one of the dancers of the Moulin Rouge and other clubs for that matter as well. Many of the identities of the people seated in the foreground have been identified. Some of them are poets. The woman at the right is rather enigmatically identified as Nellie C. Now, let's take a look at this piece in terms of formal elements. You can see that he's clearly looking at Impressionism here. Bird's eye view approach to space, asymmetrical compositional configuration, some painterly approach to the application of paint. However, line is pretty important if you take a look in the foreground. An interest in light, but in this case, it's not the Impressionist interest in natural light, but rather it's gas light. And that's the reason that the woman's face at the right is illuminated as it is. So check this particular piece if you would. It's pretty important. The title of it is the Moulin Rouge. And before we leave it, let me ask that you take a look at the repetition of curvilinear forms throughout. That is on the sleeves of the dress of the woman at the far right, the way that he has dealt with the arabesque of the two chairs that you can see as well. And what he's done is he's taken those curvilinear forms and contrasted them with geometrical forms throughout. And in doing so, perhaps he suggests in an abstract way the sensation of movement. Now, given the fact that he was so disabled, as I said earlier, he was just fascinated with the movement of the dance. So as I said, please do check this piece. It's a pretty important work of art. And let me show you a couple of more done by Toulouse-Lautrec. Again, if you have had a chance to take a look at some of the films, you will see that this is once more the floor of the Moulin Rouge. The woman just to the left of center is doing the can-can. The Moulin Rouge has been described as essentially being Toulouse-Lautrec's muse, and I think that's a fair assessment. By the way, when and if you get to Paris, visit it. It's still open today, so you can go see it. Eventually, it became sort of a gravitating place for tourists who were going to France, and it was sort of a mixed blessing. Toulouse-Lautrec did a lot of lithographs advertising the Moulin Rouge. Before he did, it was essentially a place for the artists and the intellectuals to gather. After his very successful lithographs that were essentially advertisements for the Moulin Rouge, as I said, it began to attract many tourists, often from England as well. So this is a case in point. If you take a look at the background, you will see a couple. And we know because of the top hat of the man and the type of mustache that he is wearing that he was an English tourist. So by this point in time, the Moulin Rouge was attracting many tourists from other countries as well, all throughout Europe. But this is a portrait of Jane Averill, and the title of it is Jane Averill Dancing. Remember, if you would, that she was one of the very, very few people that Toulouse-Lautrec became close to. And perhaps one of the reasons was that she, as I mentioned earlier, was actually from the aristocracy. She was not from the so-called lower classes. Most of the dancers of the Moulin Rouge, in fact, were. But you have here, again, a theme that deals with what became the ubiquitous sense of alienation that permeated culture and, for that matter, art and literature at this point in time as well. So she's out there on the dance floor doing her thing, and clearly the couple in the background are essentially ignoring her. They're lost in their own conversation, and she has her back to them. Again, the ubiquitous concern with alienation. Often he would paint on cardboard. This is a case in point, as you can see. And this is a pretty radical approach, because you see a lot of the cardboard here being left empty. There's no paint on it. Mary Cassatt did the same thing as well in some of her works, although she worked primarily in canvas. And a few more. This is also Jane Averill. It is entitled Jane Averill Leaving the Moulin Rouge. Presumably in the wee hours of the morning. Once more, the ubiquitous theme of alienation. Clearly, no one's really touching here. They're all going their separate ways. Their backs are to each other. There is a sense of despondency and depression in terms of the way that he has dealt with the figure here. Clearly, she's looking down at the ground, the expression on her face, the fact that her hands are thrust into her pockets. And that downward movement is accentuated by the style of the coat, the so-called mutton sleeves, which admittedly were the style of the time, but certainly suggest, again, this sense of alienation and depression. If you take a look at the overall quality of this painting, it's really quite decorative. And that decorative sense, decorative quality, really, I think in some ways sort of belies the theme, which I just mentioned. All those dots are a derivation of the style of pointillism, which is associated with Neo-Impressionism, primarily the work of Georges Seurat. We will not have time to talk about it this semester. Again, the overall decorative quality of this work was derived from Japanese art as well. And as the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists were highly influenced by Japanese art. And if anything, Japanese art is highly decorative. This is also Toulouse-Lautrec, woman pulling on her stocking. If you take a look down at the lower right, you will see the typical way that he signed his work with his initials. Again, his name is Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec Montfort. So you can see the initials HTL there. And that, too, was derived from Japanese art. If you know anything about Japanese art and other forms of Asian art, for that matter, as well, you will know that artists often sign their work by what are called chop marks. Their initials are placed in circular forms, and then it is stamped on the image. And Toulouse-Lautrec's Salon in the Rue de Milan. This is a fairly important work as well. If you take a look at the lower left, you will see, again, his initials in a circle, derived from the influence of Japanese art on his work, and for that matter, that of the other post-impressionists as well. But what you see here is the interior of a brothel. And this is the brothel where Toulouse-Lautrec would spend a lot of time. He'd literally move in there for months at a time, sometimes using the services provided, sometimes not. As I said to you earlier, he would treat these women with the utmost courtesy, often presiding over Sunday brunch with a silver tea set, and at least on one occasion, painting portraits of them as if they were members of the ladies in waiting in the court of a queen. The woman to the right of center, in that rather lilac-colored gown, is the madam of the brothel. You can see that she's a little older than the other women. I wish I had a detail to show you of her face, and if I did, you could see just what he can do in terms of line. Just a couple of judiciously placed lines suggest what must have been the difficulty of her life, and perhaps the bitterness of her life as well. So what you see here is an interior which is quite garish, as you can see. Tim Marlowe makes reference to the empty space at the left of the composition as being suggestive of, in one sense, perhaps that is Toulouse-Lautrec's own seat. Another scholar says that it suggests that the viewer is being invited into the action of the picture plane as well. I do have a detail, sorry. You see what I mean? Just a couple of judicious lines, and everything about the nature of her life seems to appear. A few other pieces by Toulouse-Lautrec, the theme of the lesbian, statements of fact, no, in quotes, moral judgment whatsoever, and as opposed to the way that some artists approach this theme. And this is his portrait of Oscar Wilde, who was a literary figure in England, or as he was referred to as, in quotes, Wild Oscar. At the time that this particular piece was done, and we're obviously talking about a very unenlightened age, Oscar Wilde was on trial for homosexuality. And what Toulouse-Lautrec has done is use the image of Big Ben in the background as being perhaps a reference to a phallic image. And a couple of the lithographs that he did as advertisements for the Moulin Rouge and the various dancers. Again, this is Jane Averill. As you can see, it was done in 1899. And another, also Jane Averill. This is a very, very famous image. Perhaps you've seen it before. Okay. I want to show you very, very briefly the work of Paul Cézanne and Paul Gauguin, and I am not going to burden you with remembering their names for purposes of the exams. Do please, as I said, put a check in front of Van Gogh's name and Toulouse-Lautrec's name as well. But this is the work of Paul Cézanne, and it is, as you can probably imagine, an incomplete work. And I'm showing you an incomplete work by Cézanne for a particular reason. And that's because I think it's a very useful work by which to outline for you some of the essential ideas about Paul Cézanne. So let me enumerate them for you, please. Number one, his definition of art. He said, in quotes, art is a harmony parallel to nature. Art is a harmony parallel to nature. Now that, folks, is a modern aesthetic. What he's essentially saying is that the duty of the artist is not to replicate nature, not to be mimetic, that is duplicated, but rather to create a harmony parallel with nature. Now, in some ways, that's rather similar to the definition that was promulgated, that we talked about a number of weeks ago by Leonardo da Vinci. So first of all, art is a harmony parallel to nature. Secondly, all of nature should be seen in terms of the cone, the sphere, and the cylinder. All of nature should be seen in terms of the cone, the sphere, and the cylinder, end quote. So what he did is he took the various elements of nature and filtered them through, if you will, sort of a geometrical grid, and came out with essentially geometrical and almost abstract forms, as you can see here. Now, next week, when we talk about the 20th century, at least what we can do with the 20th century, I will, of course, show you the work of Cubism. And let me point out to you right now that there would have been no Cubism had there not been Paul Cézanne. And that statement, all of nature should be seen in terms of the cone, the sphere, and the cylinder, led directly to the work done by Picasso and Braque associated with Cubism. So, next point, which has to do with color and space. Cézanne made the following statement. He said, when color is at its richest, form and space are at their fullest. When color is at its richest, form and space are at their fullest. And what he meant by that is that the painter should create space by using color. Now, you all know that anytime you put anything on a canvas or a piece of paper, or for that matter, a computer screen, you have created some semblance of space, even if it's a dot. Okay, Cézanne knew that as well. He also believed that given that painting was intrinsically a two-dimensional entity, you should not try to force it into something which it was not, that is 3 dimensions. Therefore, you should eliminate linear and aerial perspective, and rather you should create space in terms of color. That is, by juxtaposing warm versus cool colors, which you can see he has done here. So he's juxtaposed the ochre colors next to the blue colors. Pardon me. As a result, the ochre colors advances towards your eye. The blue color recedes. You have created space, but in a way which acknowledges and respects the intrinsic two-dimensionality of the picture plane. So let's take a look kind of quickly at the evolution of Cézanne's work. This particular piece was done during the mature phase of his career. This particular piece was done much earlier. It's called The Black Clock. And eventually, Cézanne becomes a colorist. That is, color becomes his primary means of expression, as you saw in the slide immediately before this particular piece. But as all artists who eventually become colorists, he believed that it was imperative to go through what he called a so-called dark phase. That is, to investigate values, because he and so many other painters who became colorists believed that the only way that you can understand color is by understanding how values relate together. So clearly this is monochromatic. It's reliant on black and white and gray, with the exception of the lemon and the pink of the shell throughout. He got involved in various series in the tradition of the Impressionists, such as Monet. The series of card players was one of them. This is an early version of the card players. The seated figure on the far left is thought to be a self-portrait. The figure on the far right is thought to be either a reference to Cézanne's father, with whom he had a very difficult relationship, or his friend, Émile Zola, who was a realist writer. And Cézanne and Zola grew up together as children, and they were friends throughout the earlier part of their adulthood. But then Zola wrote a book that Cézanne believed was based on himself in terms of the protagonist, that is the main character, who was an artist with great talent, but without the courage of his convictions. So he never, in fact, realized his true worth. So there's a sense of perhaps confrontation between Cézanne on the left and the figure on the far right, that is either Émile Zola or his father. But take a look, if you would, in terms of form, as to how this same series, that is the card players, does evolve. The forms are more cubic, as you can see here. It's not fair to use the term cubist, certainly, but they are more cubic. And this piece is a little bit more abstract than this particular piece, as you can see as well. And that's the typical way that the art of Cézanne did evolve. Another case in point, another series. This is a series of Mont Saint-Victoire. And we're very fortunate in that we have in the DIA one of the paintings of this particular series. It was a mountain near where he lived. It was about 10 miles away from where he lived, Aix-en-Provence in the south of France. And it became really an obsession with him. He painted en plein air, that is outdoors. He would take his gear, set up his easel. Art historians who are interested in this kind of trivia have found the exact spot where he would often set up his easel. Ironically enough, this mountain eventually did lead to his early death, fairly early death, I should say. He had a bad cold, and his wife suggested that he not go outside to work this particular day because the weather was very bad. It was raining, it was cold, but he insisted on going, and the cold turned into pneumonia, and as a result, he died. But as you can see, the series evolves, becomes more abstracted. This piece as well, you guys are all visually sensitive. Of course, you can see the mountain here. Imagine, if you would, people at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, looking at paintings like this. Certainly, they must have been really rather baffled in terms of what the subject matter was. But those of you who know a little bit about Cubism will see how this particular painting will influence Cubism. Now, admittedly, there's color here. And eventually, as you will see next week, the Cubists do away with color, and they produced essentially monochromatic images. But all of nature should be seen in terms of the cone, the sphere, and the cylinder, and that leads directly into Cubism. His still lives are really quite famous as well. And very often he will use several different vanishing points in them. They become, again, more and more abstracted, more and more removed from representational reality. However, he does not ever completely become non-objective in his work. There's always a reference to something of nature. This is called The Grand Bathers by Cézanne, and it is thought by some people to be perhaps his strongest work. I disagree. I think it's quite contrived in some ways. That is, it's as if he sort of forces the figures of the female figures to conform to the triangular compositional configuration. But speaking of, clearly this is a very classical work of art, reliant on a closed compositional configuration, reliant on the triangle as well. If that reminds you of things to do with the Renaissance, it certainly should. And about attendance, folks, please, so that I can do the required attendance report for all students. Please send me an email at my email address with your full name in the subject line and the number 202 on the subject line, and then I'll be able to record your attendance. Okay, real quickly, folks, without burdening with remembering this particular name, this is the work of Paul Gauguin, the fourth of the post-impressionist painters. And this is a self-portrait of Gauguin. This is the man that Vincent van Gogh finally convinced to go down to Arles to set up this artist commune, and the rather tragic results that happen. And I think this is a very good characterization of the man. Yes, he was a great artist, not a nice human being. His wife married not a painter, but a stockbroker, which was his profession at the time, and she thought she was going to live a very respectable upper middle class life as the wife of a stockbroker. But he became obsessed with art. And he made the following statement. He said, "The greatest mistake, no matter how beautiful, was Greek art," by which he meant the problem with Western art was a reliance on the intellectual at the expense of the emotional, the intuitive, the, if you will, primitive. So as a result, Gauguin believed that it was necessary to leave Western Europe and go to the South Seas, which he did, abandoning his family. He did go back a couple of times. He did send them some money, but all in all, for all intents and purposes, he did abandon them. So I think the halo on this particular piece is fairly ironic. The reference to the apples and the rather serpent-like shape in the foreground of this painting, I think, are allusions to the biblical story of Adam and Eve, that is the original sin. And one of the pieces that he did in the South Seas, when Tahiti became a little bit too civilized for him, he went even more deeply into the South Seas, the Day of the Gods. And that, folks, is my last image. So as always, if you have any questions, please do email me. As soon as you finish viewing this piece, if you would, please send me the requisite email with the number in it so I can record your attendance. Also, folks, if you have not submitted your paper to me, please do email it to me as soon as you can. And I will see you next time. Take care.